Okay, so I talked a bit about those early Greek Stoics, Zeno and Chrysippus, and towards the end I mentioned Epictetus. Justin earlier on mentioned Seneca briefly. These are all Roman Stoics writing in the first 2 centuries AD. And those 3, Seneca, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, are the 3 famous Roman Stoics whose texts survive, and you can all go to the bookshop and buy them and read them today. Unlike Chrysippus' 705 books that are all gone, right? So when a lot of people think about Stoicism, they think about the works of these 3 Roman Stoics, right? Because those are the ones they can read and engage with. There's a 4th Roman Stoic. Well, there are multiple, there are many, but there's a 4th one worth mentioning, and I'll refer to him a bit later on. He was a guy called Musonius Rufus, who taught philosophy in Rome in the 1st century AD, and Epictetus, when he was still a slave, was allowed to attend Musonius's lectures. So Epictetus learns his Stoic philosophy from Musonius Rufus, and he's a really interesting character as well that people are starting to pay a bit more attention to. He has some interesting things to say about gender equality and why women ought to study philosophy, right? Which was, a fairly novel idea in 1st century Rome, in a culture where women weren't even allowed to own property. So that's a kind of interesting theme that we see in his work. Again, stressing the thought that just mentioned a moment ago about rationality being the defining characteristic of a human being, and all the other characteristics not interesting, right? It's rationality that matters, and we ought to feel a shared kinship with all other rational beings, right? Not that we ought to be unpleasant to the non-rational ones, but that should be our sense of what a human community looks like. I'll come back to that thought in a moment. So we've got these 3 or 4 Roman Stoics active, and as I've said, we can read their texts. And they're all well worth reading. I would really encourage you, if you haven't already. There's a lot of humour in Epictetus, for instance. He sometimes reads like a kind of Zen master with a big stick, ready to hit his students if they say anything stupid. There's a really good read. And it's a text that Marcus Aurelius was reading, right? It's one of the key sources that inspired his work in the Meditations. Okay, so Justin gave us a brief introduction to Marcus earlier on. I won't say too much about the kind of biography. I want to focus on the Meditations themselves. So, as Justin said, Marcus was a very bookish young boy, fascinated by philosophy at a young age, had a whole series of philosophy tutors, most of whom were committed Stoics. So he was studying this stuff in great detail. He was reading those 705 books by Chrysippus that weren't lost at that point. And he was from a very privileged family in Rome, but he wasn't born or destined to be emperor. He was adopted twice. He was adopted by one guy who was then adopted by the emperor, and he wasn't growing up expecting to become emperor of Rome, but that's where he ends up. And while he's emperor, in the last decade of his life, so probably in his 50s, he writes this book, The Meditations, and it's very much a private notebook. It wasn't anything intended for publication. It's got a huge amount of repetition in it. There are references to events in his own life without any context that make no sense. There are odd passages where we get a set of quotations where it looks like it's his commonplace book, and he's, I'm going to read a bit of Plato, and here are 3 or 4 quotes from Plato that caught my mind. Then he moves on to the next thing. There's no real order or organisation to this book at all, right? So what's he doing in the Meditations? Why did he write it? What was its purpose? And I think if we can get an understanding of the purpose of the text, we'll be able to extract even more from it ourselves. Well, what Marcus is doing is engaged in what we might call written exercises. What he's trying to do is remind himself of key philosophical ideas and trying to digest those ideas into himself so that he can transform his character. So he says, your mind will take on the character of the most frequent thoughts. Souls are dyed by thoughts, so dye your own with a succession of thoughts like these, right? So have you ever found if you watch just a bit too much rolling news, you start to get a bit miserable and depressed? Because you're dyeing your soul with constant negative thoughts, because positive news stories aren't interesting, so you don't get any. You just get all the negative news stories. So think about what you're taking in, right? Think about the material that you present to your mind on a daily basis, right? Because that's going to shape your character, whether you notice it or not. And Marcus is very conscious of this. So he wants to remind himself only of the ideas that he wants to be in his head, shaping who he is. And we can see that this is precisely what he's doing by the way in which he opens so many of the passages. So as I've got them up there, always remember, he says, constantly think, contemplate continually, think continually. You'll see this throughout the book. This is just him giving himself daily reminders, right? Nowadays, you'll just buy an app which will flash up your daily reminders for you, but he didn't have that then. He had to do it himself the old-fashioned way and write them out. And he tells us what he's doing. He reflects on his own practice. Again, just writing to himself. He says, as doctors have their instruments and scalpels always at hand to meet sudden demands for treatment, so do you have your doctrines ready. And so do you, and so to do everything, even the very smallest, mindful of those doctrines, right? Keep your doctrines ready to hand, your key principles, right? So there are kind of two stages in what we might call philosophical training here, right? There's the first stage in which you work out what you think, you follow through the arguments, as I was doing in part one, you decide, okay, these are the things that I think are important and that are valuable. This is how I want to live my life. That's the intellectual part, the theoretical part. The second part is, okay, how do I incorporate those into myself? How do I transform myself in the light of those principles? And this is the second stage. This is the process of training where we try to digest these ideas. So we need to dye our souls by paying close attention to what we expose them to. There's a great passage in Epictetus, you also find this in Seneca, where they draw an analogy with digestion. And Epictetus says, mocking his first-year philosophy students, he says, first-year philosophy students, they come to my lectures, they hear all this stuff, and then they just repeat it all. They spew it out of their mouth. They vomit it back out. I mean, this is the verb, right? Vomit, to vomit. People vomit philosophy out of their mouth, right? That's not what sheep do. Sheep don't eat grass and then vomit the grass back out of their mouths. They digest it. And the product is the milk and the wool that they produce. And Epictetus says, it ought to be the same with philosophy. You don't hear all this stuff and then vomit it back out your mouth. You hear all this stuff and then you digest it into yourself. And rather than producing wool and milk, you produce virtuous actions. And so that's the product that you're trying to get to. So that's what Marcus is doing here. He's trying to engage in this process of digestion to transform himself. And he's doing it here through the practice of writing. And of course, lots of people still today do this through writing. These days, it's called journaling, right? And you can buy books just to do it. And Ryan Holiday and Steve Hanselman published a book a few years ago called The Daily Stoic. Some of you might know it. And then they produced a Daily Stoic notebook. Here it is. If you're feeling particularly cynical about it, they have a bestseller book. How can we cash in on that? Okay, we'll sell a book that's completely empty off the back of it. Here's our Daily Stoic notebook, right? Good strategy, right? But that's a little unfair, and you can see there are prompts throughout. Here you can write your meditations, just like Marcus, every day, to remind yourself of your key ideas, to reflect on how you've done each day, and you can write it all down in your Stoic notebook. So the Meditations isn't a kind of special text for us to just kind of take advice from. It's also a text that we can copy and imitate as something that we can use in our own practice to try to incorporate these ideas into our own lives in order to transform ourselves and improve our character. And this is a website, thestoicwriter.com, run by Catherine, a wonderful Australian who now lives in Scotland. She was also in Athens in the autumn, gave a great talk about Stoic journaling and how people can use this. She does all sorts of weird Facebook stuff where people do Facebook hangouts. I'm not on Facebook, I don't know this stuff. But they all come together and they kind of do this collectively and really benefit from it. So that's the sort of practice that people might take away from reading the Meditations once we've got a sense of what Marcus is actually doing. Okay, put this in a wider context. I mentioned Musonius Rufus earlier on. Here's a couple of bits from Musonius Rufus. The doctor and the musician, he says, not only must master the theoretical side of their respective arts, but must also train themselves to act according to their principles. So as I was saying a moment ago, these kind of two different stages in our education. First, you've got to study the principles, just like the doctor does, and then you've got to go into the practical training, on the job, right? But in this case, on the job is the rest of your life. How could a person, he continues, how could a person immediately become moderate if they only knew that one must not be overcome by pleasures and was quite unpracticed in withstanding pleasures? How could someone become just when they had learned that one must love fairness but had never exercised themselves in avoidance of selfishness and greed? So we need to train ourselves. We need to put ourselves to the test. We need to see if the nice words that we can accept theoretically, we can actually implement in our own lives. And in order to do that, we need to train ourselves. And when we think about looking after ourselves or taking care of ourselves, we might think of some of the things that were mentioned earlier, right? Okay, I'm going to look after my diet, I'm going to go to the gym. Right? I've never been to a gym in my life. We might pay more attention to our health in various ways. We might, go and get our hair cut and scrub ourselves down, make ourselves look presentable. This is kind of what we think looking after ourselves looks like. But in this context, of course, who we really are is our character. That's the bit that has value. So the training that we need to engage in, the self-care that we need to take, is training of our souls, right? Don't get freaked out by the word soul, depending what your theological views are. This is just our minds, right? Since a human being is not mind or soul alone, nor body alone, but a kind of synthesis of the two, the person in training must take care of both. The better part, the soul, the mind, character, more zealously, as is fitting, but also the other. So don't completely neglect your body. Don't become the unwashed cynic in the barrel, right? Have some self-respect, but that's not what matters. What matters is taking care of one's soul or character. So what does that actually involve? And Musonius continues, So training that's peculiar to the soul consists first of all in seeing that the proofs pertaining to apparent goods as not being real goods are always ready at hand. This is a key phrase that we'll see again and again in these Roman Stoic texts. Ready at hand. And likewise those pertaining to apparent evils as not being real evils. And in learning to recognize the things which are truly good. And in becoming accustomed to distinguish them from what is not really good. So these two key ideas I'll just comment on briefly. Keeping things ready at hand, constant reminders, right? Because we're all weak and terrible and inconsistent, we need to be constantly reminded about the things that we think have most value. And of course, at the same time, we're constantly being bombarded by all sorts of other external influences, the 24-hour rolling news and all the rest of it, that can knock us off course. So we need to isolate our stuff from all of those negative influences and keep the key ideas that we think are most important through constant reminder. And we need to become accustomed. We need to develop the right habits. We need to digest these things into us. So it's a process of retraining our habits, if you like. Okay, so that gives us a sense of the nature of the project that's at play here, right? And how we might start to do it. What about Marcus himself? All of the Stoics are individuals. Seneca has his own character, and there are certain things that he focuses on. Epictetus, the same, and Marcus too. So Marcus is an orthodox Stoic. There's nothing in him that particularly deviates from Stoicism, but the sorts of things that he stresses in particular are things specific to him. They all have their own different focus. So what are Marcus's main concerns, right? Well, one thing he stresses again and again and again is that he's part of nature. If you cut out all the little uninteresting words, the ands and the thens and the its and all the rest of it, the most common word in the Meditations is physis, nature. It's the one word that crops up again and again. He's part of nature. He's not an isolated individual. He's part of something larger than himself. He's an integrated part of that larger thing, right? And his own well-being depends upon the well-being of that larger thing. And we'll hear a bit about sustainability and environmental concerns a little later on, I think, right? So he's part of nature, an integrated part of nature. And nature's constantly changing. Nothing's permanent, nothing stays the same. Everything in his life is constantly undergoing change. And that's just a fact, and we all have to accept it. And fighting against that is only going to lead to frustration and disappointment. And he'll quickly be forgotten after his death. He obviously has an issue with posthumous fame. This is something that obviously is on his mind, and that might sound a bit kind of narcissistic, but to put it in context, of course, he's the Emperor of Rome, right? It's expected that people will write histories about him afterwards. He's expected to have a posthumous reputation, as every other emperor has had. So unlike us, who will all be dead and forgotten in 100 years, and there'll be no trace of our existence whatsoever, right? Marcus knows that he's going to be remembered. So then the question is, but what are they going to write about me? So understandably, he's quite concerned about that. So he's constantly reminding himself that he will be that he too will be forgotten, despite that kind of sense that he'll end up in the history books. And so he shouldn't be too worried about that either. What else does he remind himself of a lot? He reminds himself that all people are akin to him, that all human beings are part of a single global community united by their shared rationality, and all other differences between people are unimportant. Constantly reminds himself of this. And he also reminds himself that if other people act badly towards him, if they act antisocially, it's not their fault. It's due to their ignorance rather than any malice. I'll come back to that thought a bit in a moment. He also reminds himself that he always ought to act justly towards other people, no matter how they behave towards him. So these are the things he's constantly telling himself. These are the things that he feels he needs to work on, right? And in a book like this, right, and if any of you keep a journal or write stuff already, or if you're inspired to do so in the future, the things you'll write about will be all your character faults, right? You won't write about all the stuff that's okay and that you've nailed, because you don't need to work on that. You'll only write about all of your weaknesses and failures, right? Spend less time on social media. Spend less time on social media. Don't worry about this. Don't worry, You'll write about all of those things that you want to work on. And that's what Marcus is doing, right? So from this, you might get the impression that Marcus struggles to act compassionately towards other people. He struggles to act justly towards other people. That's something that he needs to work on, and he's constantly reminding himself of it. And of course, as emperor, it's especially important that he behaves well towards other people if he's going to act well. And then final thought, again, that he constantly reminds himself of, that he can't control external events. He can't control his posthumous fame. He can't control what other people think about him now. He can't control how other people behave. The only thing he can control is how he thinks and acts in the present moment. That's the only thing that he can control. Notwithstanding being autocratic emperor of the known Western world, the only thing he thinks he can control is how he thinks and acts right now. Everything else is beyond him. Okay, let's look at a few bits and pieces from the Meditations. Not too many. Here's one passage. This passage, which is Book 4, Chapter 3, is it's a quite long piece. It kind of summarizes the whole Meditations. It's a really interesting passage in the book as a whole. It gives a sense of what he's doing in the whole book. It's really striking. He says that he's going to rehearse some brief and fundamental truths that will wash away all his sorrow. So what is it that he's recalling? Which truths is he recalling? He says, recall the judgment that reasonable creatures are coming to the world for the sake of one another. That patience is part of justice. So again, he's struggling to kind of deal with other people. That men do wrong involuntarily, and the many proofs that the universe is a kind of commonwealth. So he's constantly reminding himself how to behave towards other people, how to treat them, to see them as parts of an extended cosmopolitan family, we might say. And then secondly, to go back to the nature theme, look at the swiftness of the oblivion of all men, the gulf of endless time behind and before, the hollowness of applause, the fickleness and folly of those who seem to speak well of you, and the narrow room in which it is confined. This should make you pause. So again, putting the relatively brief span of his own life within a much broader context, right? A much broader spatial context and temporal context. And I'll come back to that thought in a moment. A bit more from the same passage. And among these ideas to keep ready to hand, so that idea we saw earlier, keeping these ideas ready to hand for frequent reference, have these two, he says to himself. One, that things themselves have no hold on the mind, but stand unmoved outside, and that disturbances, including emotions, come only from our judgments about things. It's the judgments that we make, the value judgments we make, that produce the emotional disturbances that we experience. I judge that X is good, I pursue it, I don't get it, I experience an emotion of frustration. But of course, if X is some external thing, and the Stoics have already told us that it isn't inherently valuable, then we've made a mistaken judgment when we judge that it's good. And so if we remind ourselves of those key principles I was talking about in the first half, we'll avoid making those sorts of judgments and avoid those negative emotions. Second, that all that your eyes behold will change in a moment and be no more. And of how many things you have already witnessed the changes, think continually of that. The universe is constant change, and life is merely the product of our opinions. These are the ideas he wants to keep in mind, right? So his mental equanimity, his state of mind, is entirely within his control because it's based on those judgments he makes. And he ought not get too attached to things in the external world because they're constantly changing anyway. They're not going to be around for long. Right, let's look at some specific exercises that Marcus uses in the meditations. Morning reflections, there's a typo there, it should be physical descriptions, and then what we'll call the view from above. So I'll quickly go through some of these. First one, we often talk in Stoicism about the premeditation of future evils. This is something that we use in Stoic Week. We get people to do this every morning in Stoic Week, if any of you have used that already. This is a great passage from the Meditations. It's one of my favourites. Say to yourself in the early morning, I shall meet today inquisitive, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, uncharitable men. Right? And it probably will be men. Right? Prepare yourself first thing in the morning that you're going to meet people who are going to be unpleasant and grumpy and difficult, because you may well do, right? Obviously, Marcus is writing from the perspective of running the imperial court. All the people are coming asking for stuff from him, and he's preparing himself for that, right? So this is what we call the premeditation of future evil, right? Think in advance at the beginning of the day of unpleasant things that might happen to you during the day in order to mentally prepare for them, right? For two reasons, right? So if those things come to pass, you're mentally prepared to cope with it, and so it won't strike you so hard, right? Of course everyone was rude and obnoxious and pushing me on the train first thing this morning. Of course they were, right? It would be ludicrous to expect anything else, and I'm mentally prepared for that, so I'm not going to be bothered by it, right? That's what commuting to work looks like. Get over it. Equally, if that doesn't happen, and as it happens this morning, everyone was very civilized on the Underground, then you've got all the more reason to be happy. You appreciate that all the more because you're all too aware of the fact that it could have gone very differently. So you become more appreciative when things go well, but better mentally prepared when things don't go well. And that's why you might engage in these sorts of morning reflections. One thing I should stress, right? So this is sometimes quoted out of context, as I've just quoted it out of context, to suggest that Marcus was a bit of a misanthrope, right? I think it's worth stressing what he says immediately after this. He says, and also remind yourself that it's not their fault. No one chooses to be ungrateful and miserable and antisocial. No one chooses to live like that. If people behave like that, it's out of ignorance, or tiredness, right? These people are tired and grumpy, they haven't had any sleep, they're probably new parents, they've got all sorts of stuff going on in their own lives, they're not acting antisocially towards you, they're just so wrapped up in whatever mess they're dealing in their own lives that they've not even noticed that you're there. So it's out of ignorance or any other difficulties that they might be dealing with. They're not deliberately acting against you. The appropriate response ought not to be to act unpleasantly in return, but to show compassion, right? Because, as we saw earlier in that passage from Epictetus dealing with the virtues, no one would choose to be like that. Right? And I'm sure we've all had days when we've been a bit like that, but not out of choice. None of us wanted to be that person that day, but sometimes if you've been up 3 times in the night with a baby, you're not on your best form first thing the following morning, or whatever it might be. So that's one type of exercise that Marcus engages in the meditations that we can take and we might be able to benefit from in our own lives. Mentally prepare in advance for how things might go. Second one, physical descriptions. I think this is quite a nice one. It's not often commented on too much, but it's really quite striking in the meditations, I think, once you start to notice it. And this is about our relationship or attitude to external things in the world. So he says, always make a figure or outline of the imagined object as it occurs in order to see distinctly what it is in its essence, naked, as a whole and parts, and say to yourself its individual name and the names of the things of which it was compounded and into which it will be broken up. For nothing is so able to create greatness of mind as the power methodically and truthfully to test each thing that one meets in life, or that meets one in life, and always to look upon it so as to attend at the same time to the use which this particular thing contributes to a universe of a certain definite kind, what value it has in reference to the whole, and what to man. So, there's some fancy new shiny car that you think would be great. You really want it, you can't afford it, you're frustrated, it's out of your reach. Engage in the process of physical description. What is this thing? Well, ultimately it's just a lump of metal and plastic. In 10 years' time, it will literally be on a scrap heap and will be worth absolutely nothing. Right? Fact. Is it really something worth pursuing? Well, if you've got the money and it's not a great inconvenience, why not? Is it worth something getting emotionally distressed about? No. Engage in the physical description of those objects of desire that you have, see what they really are, and then you'll be able to gain some perspective on them. Right? I really want that successful career in this firm. That would be fantastic. Think of all the prestige. Well, I'll be starting at 7:30 in the morning. I'll probably finish at 7:30 at night. They might let me turn my email off in the evening. I don't know yet. Analyse it into its constituent parts. What would it actually involve? Think it through. Here's a great example of this. Always good to do this a bit before lunch. Surely it's an excellent plan when you are seated before delicacies and choice foods to impress upon your imagination that this is the dead body of a fish, that the dead body of a bird or a pig, and again that the Falernian wine is grape juice, and that the robe, the imperial robe of purple, is a lamb's fleece dipped in shellfish's blood. Surely these are excellent impressions going to the heart of actual facts and penetrating them so as to see the kind of things they really are. So this is a way of putting all those external things into context. Right, third and final one. I mentioned earlier on about Marcus wanting to put his own relatively short life within a much wider temporal and spatial context, and we saw an image of a galaxy earlier on. This is what's often referred to as the view from above. We see this throughout Marcus. Here's just one example. Watch and see the courses of the stars as if you ran with them, and continually dwell in mind upon the changes of the elements into one another. For these imaginations wash away the foulness of life on the ground. Moreover, when discoursing about mankind, look upon earthly things below as if from some place above them, herds, armies, farms, weddings, divorces, births, deaths, the noise of the law courts, lonely places, diverse foreign nations, festivals, funerals, marketplaces, a mixture of everything and an order composed of countries. And then in another passage, Asia and Europe are corners in the universe. Every sea a drop in the universe. Mount Athos, merely a clod of earth in the universe. Every instant of time a pinprick of eternity. And Justin mentioned earlier one of his mentors being an astronaut, and it's interesting some of the reports you hear from people that have been up to space, and they look down and they say, well, the idea that these are all separate divided countries that are fighting each other just seems absurd. Once you've got that different perspective and you look down, you're obviously looking at one single global community of people. And that's an idea that Marcus is very keen on. Okay, so these are all exercises that we might practice ourselves in order to help us put things in perspective. Right. So, final bit, just to sum things up and pull things together. These are some of the techniques that we've seen him use. What's the point of all of this? What's the goal? What's Marcus's goal? Well, for Marcus, there are these things that come out again and again that he thinks is what this is all about. To see other people as fellow citizens in a shared community rather than opponents. To treat others with compassion and patience, even when they act against us. To see that the natural world is constantly changing and that change is inevitable and nothing to be feared. And to see that we're parts of something larger than ourselves. We're not isolated individuals. We're part of this larger community of human beings, but we're also part of the natural world. And of course, our survival and well-being depends upon the well-being of the natural world. Not to place too much value on other people's views about us is another thing that Marcus stresses a lot. And to see success as acting simply as the best that we can at any given moment, rather than focusing on external rewards down the line. And again, we're dealing with the autocratic ruler of the known Western world. And the thing that he reminds himself repeatedly, when you think he could do whatever it is he might want, is simply to act as best as he can in the present moment, according to those Stoic principles. Okay, I'll stop there. I'm very happy to take any more questions that you might have.